Hello and welcome to another tutorial. We're going to continue our discussion with Eclipse IDE's external tool, which is a very powerful thing to have in an IDE, and it allows us to run external applications on our Java files or any other thing that you want to do. And the goal here is to learn about these environment variables that are part of the reason that the external tool is very basically powerful, because when you run an external application through the Eclipse IDE knows a lot about the organization of your Java project, and then it provides this internal environment variables that are specific to the Eclipse IDE, and it allows you to write basically commands in the external tool that change based on which files, for example, are selected in your tree view in the project view, for example. Now, so far we've seen some of the most important internal variables that the Eclipse IDE provides, and some of them actually can accept arguments, and you add arguments using colon. So you still have the dollar, curly braces, and the name of the variable, but then if you want to add a particular argument to this specific parameter or variable, you add colon, right? For example, project class path, we saw that if you just use it by itself, the Eclipse substitutes this variable with all the directories that are on the class path of your Java project, and then obviously the class path separator is colon. But if we want to just select a particular project, we can give the name of that project in Eclipse as the argument to this project class path environment variable. So you can add a project name. I believe you can only specify one particular name. You cannot specify like two names, but if you want to select a particular project that is on the class path, you can just provide the name of that project as an argument. If all projects are desired, you don't need to pass any argument, right? You just use the project class path here, right? So let's go back to Eclipse IDE. Again, we create this project. There are two class files here, and then what we want to do, we go back and external tool. I set it up to this dummy external tool is set to just echo whatever a string that we write to the console itself, so that we actually see how this substitution works. And we said that any external tool has to be run inside some sort of directory that's called the working directory, because this external tool actually mimics basically the behavior of the terminal, right? Whenever you write echo here, it means you're running this command in this binary application inside some working directory, right? And then any command that you execute in terminal has to be inside some sort of working directory. And we said that if you want to point to the class files, you have to set the working directory to the bin of the Java project, because Eclipse compiler organizes the compiled class files in the bin. Now, project class path, if we run this right now, it looks which file is selected, and it looks at the project that this file belongs to, and then it prints the class path of that project. All right, now let's go back and give it an argument. So project class path, I want to tell it just print the path to the particular project, and you specify the name. Let's say our own project Java native image, right? So we tell it project class path, but we give it a name of the parameter. So apply, run. So let's see. If we select this and then dummy external tool, yeah, what's interesting that it still prints. Is it okay? No, I think it still prints the. Yeah, that's interesting. So let's go back here. Java. So that's interesting that it is still, I'm not sure if this is so project class path and then Java image. So let's write something that doesn't exist. So command line could not be retrieved because this doesn't exist. Let's go back, Java native image, show command. Okay, bin echo. Oh, okay, so that's because let's see. So it points to the bin directory. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this one works. So I think you cannot filter only the current project, but you can filter other projects that are on your class path, because obviously your current project should always be there. So I think it doesn't work on the current project, right? The project that you're selecting. Apply, show command line. No, it doesn't. So if you want to select some of the projects that are dependencies on your class path, you can basically specify them as the parameter to your project class path. But you cannot just select the current project. It doesn't work, right? So the argument can be basically other projects that are on your class path, not the current project. All right. So back here, system properties. So we know that when we run Eclipse IDE, it actually runs on a JVM itself, right? And if you want to see the properties of that JVM that Eclipse runs, you can use the system property and give it some parameters like Java home, right? We know that the system properties are -d something, right? And so let's go back to Eclipse. So this Java home shows what JRE used for running Eclipse IDE. Remember, Eclipse IDE runs on a JVM. And you can actually investigate that if you go to Eclipse, about Eclipse, and then installation details, and then configuration. So basically this retrieves all the information about the JVM that Eclipse IDE is running on, right? So macOS -OS, and then architecture 64, it has the splash, show a splash, Eclipse launcher, Eclipse plugin, etc. And then -VM. -VM is the virtual machine, and it's using OpenJDK hotspot JRE full. So right now Eclipse IDE is not running on any of the JDKs that I manually installed. It's running on the JRE that comes by default with Eclipse IDE. So I think from a few older versions, like 2019, the late versions in 2019, they included a full JRE from OpenJDK into, so that the Eclipse also comes by default with that. But you can put it to the libjli of any JDK, so you can change this. Just you have to point this, replace this argument with the libjli dot dynamically, or if you're on Linux, for example, .so. On Windows it's .dll, for example, and then the Eclipse IDE runs that particular JVM. Eclipse home location, again, these are the system properties. And then -XX use G1GC, so the JVM that Eclipse is running on is using G1GC. Use string deduplication, add module, start on first thread, org Eclipse stability, internal carbon small fonts, for example. So these are all the system properties. Java.vm.info, mix mode, etc. But then in the environment variables that the Eclipse provides, here, for example, it has this system properties, system property. And if you look at the description, returns the value of a system property from the Eclipse runtime. What it means is that the Eclipse runtime is the JVM that Eclipse is running on. A system property name must be specified as an argument. So you cannot just use the system property by itself. You have to give it an argument. And if you look at the configure, so arguments, if you don't know which arguments this system property uses, you can select configure, and it shows you all the arguments that system property of the Eclipse IDE uses. And we already saw those in the configuration tab in the about Eclipse IDE. For example, Eclipse commands, Eclipse application, Eclipse VM, Eclipse VM args, for example. So let's look at the Java class path. Let's look at the class path that the Eclipse IDE uses to run the application, and the class path is this one. This jar file is on the class path, org Eclipse Equinox launcher .jar, right? And it's inside the Eclipse IDE application. So that's on the class path. We can look at other configuration. So let's go back to our external tool, system property. system property, and then let's look at other arguments that we can pass. For example, Eclipse VM. Let's say we want to know which JVM, where is the path to the JVM that Eclipse is using for launching. So okay, and then apply. Let's run it, and it tells me it's an application eclipse.app, contents, Eclipse, plugins, OpenJDK, hotspot, JRE full, macOS, libjli.dilib, right? So it tells me Eclipse is right now it's running on its own internal JRE. It's not using a JRE from the JDKs that I have installed, right? And other things. But as you can see, it's very nice because not only you can use this variables list to tell you which variables you use. Some of them, if they accept arguments, there is a configure button here that is enabled. For example, it's workspace location configure. Right now it doesn't have anything, but let's look at project class path. Let's see it. You can select all the projects in the directory, and then they are passed as an argument. So project class path, dev Java, right? And what you're going to notice here is that if I select project class path and then hit configure, we can also select the current project, right? Java native image, etc. So if you don't know what arguments you can pass, you can select on the click on the configure and see which options are available, right? And for example, environment variable. And then let's say you want to actually, this is something that it's good to talk about. Now we know that the terminal or applications, when you run an executable binary in a terminal, you have your application is aware of the environment variables that are basically defined for your terminal. So let's say we want to print path. Let's see if this works. And it doesn't work. And basically it's a string substitution, whereas in the terminal, if I tell it echo path, it's going to print the path environment variable, right? So the question is it possible to define these? So let's see. If we go to the variable and select environment var, so returns the value of an environment variable. An environment variable name must be specified as an argument, right? So environment var, and then we give it an argument, colon, let's say we call it path. So we want to look at the value of the environment variable, which is path. Let's see, let's run this again. And now it correctly returns the path environment variable, right? So again, if you want to also use the any of the global environment variables that are defined for your operating system, for your terminal, you use this internal Eclipse variable environment val and then path. If you just tell it $path, Eclipse doesn't recognize this because $ on the terminal, it refers to environment variables, but for Eclipse this $ doesn't mean anything. So again, and if you recall, in our terminal we define this class path environment variable, right? And if I apply and run, I have to select something and then tell it run it. And you see the class path, that environment variable is still set, right? So if you want to use any of those environment variables that you use in your terminal, you can use this $curly braces environment var, and you pass the name of the environment variable as an argument to this environment var, basically internal Eclipse IDE's variables, right? And in order to specify an argument for a parameter, you give it this colon, right? After the colon, you pass the arguments. If you look at variables again and environment var, right now it doesn't show anything because Eclipse doesn't really know which environment variables you've defined, but it's good to understand this. Again, I have to select something first and then run my Eclipse IDE, and it correctly shows all the directories that are on my path environment variable. So arguments, colon, and then the argument. And the most important ones are obviously environment var is also important, project class path, system property, and then workspace location. So let's say we want to specify a relative path to the workspace. We can tell it the workspace location, right? In the configure it's empty, but that's fine. But from here we can pass colon, which means we're passing an argument, and let's say the name of the project, Java native image, some project, right? What it does, it tells whatever the value, the string value of the workspace location is, append the rest. So when you pass an argument to the to this workspace location, it appends the rest to that. So if we apply, we run, and right now this is my workspace location, and then the rest that I specified, the name of the project, was appended. So when you pass an argument to workspace location, adds the relative path of the directory inside workspace, right? So you don't need to remember what the value of the workspace is. You just use this internal environment variable. You pass in an argument, which is a path, relative path with respect to the workspace, and Eclipse automatically appends that. So returns the full or absolute path to the bin directory of some project. We can specify this project bin directory as an argument to the workspace location. And again, if you want to use the global environment variables of the system, you use the env_var environment variable. I think it's also here. So env environment variable, but then you have to specify the name of that environment variable as a argument, as a parameter. All right. So finally, let's quickly also have a look. We've seen this. Now let's see, again, have a quick look at the window for the environment external tool. So you go and select on this new button, and you create a new external tool. You give it a name, whatever name you want, and then you location. And this location has to be the absolute location, absolute path to the executable file that represents this application, right? For example, native image for GraalVM is inside the home lib svm substrate VM bin native image. And we know that in the bin directory, there inside home there is also bin directory, but in there is a native image that is a symbolic link to the actual executable file, which is inside lib svm bin native image. And then when you want to configure native image, obviously you have to point it to the where the class files is, and the class files in Eclipse projects is inside the bin directory. So the project location, I'm using an internal environment variable, and then /bin, right? And then you have to give it the class path. Right now I'm not specifying the class path, but in general you have to specify the class path, and we already know that the project_class path, that's what we do. Java type name, native image acts on basically class files, so you have to use the Java type name, which returns the fully qualified name of the class file, right? Even though we select a source file in the tree view of the Eclipse IDE, it returns the fully qualified name of the class file, and then you can tell it what is going to be the output name of the project and where to put it, right? The name of the binary, typically project name, right? Or you can select it to choose, for example, the class name, etc., right? So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to finish up on this and actually give you a demo. And next, we're going to also how to set it up for the Maven build tool, because when you use Maven to build your Java project, the directory hierarchy is a little bit different. So Maven doesn't put the compiled class files in the bin directory. So we will see how to also use the native image, build a external tool that works, is compatible with the Maven builds. So please stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.